Hello, and welcome to ASMR Game Studios. So, presumably, you are here for our game trial. Is that correct? Excellent. So, what you're going to be doing today is playtesting the beta version of our newest game. It is called The Game of Frustrating Choices, which I know could be said about many games, but we have chosen to apply that here as our title. And, with some beta versions that you may be familiar with, once they get to what is called the beta stage, they're fairly advanced, fairly developed in terms of plot or world building, and in terms of spells, armor, items, and so forth. What we're going to be doing today is a little bit different. You're going to have a very limited pool of choices. And you're going to just explore one or two areas in the game. So what I'm gonna do is help you personally sort of set up your character in terms of race and class and a few starting items. And then another member of our team will get you fitted with the glasses and help you begin the game. So of course the reason it is a little bit more rudimentary is because this is a virtual reality game. You will be involved in a game world that does affect many of your senses. Of course you will be able to escape it at any time. So before we begin, I'd like to take just a little bit of information down about you. Is that alright? Great. Alright, so first of all, would you please tell me your age? There won't be very many questions. These are just a few mandatory ones before we get started. Alright, so this is an important one. Do you have any medical conditions that might be relevant? As you know, our virtual reality system, even though this is a prototype for this particular game, is fairly advanced. It can be, immersive, emotional. So if you have any history of heart problems, for example, we do advise that you probably find perhaps a more relaxing mode of entertainment. Yeah, and if you do know anybody who's interested, we do have some, we call them games or experiences, some relaxation-based virtual reality systems in development too. Okay. Alright, so just allergies, you say? Yeah, of course, you can experience ingesting potions and stuff in the game, but of course there's no real-life correlation, so you shouldn't have to worry about allergies. Alright, so if you don't mind me asking, how did you hear of our trial today? Through a friend? Okay. And their name? Great. I know you may be surprised that I haven't asked this yet, but of course I would like to know too your full name. And how do you spell that? Great, thank you. Just a couple more questions. First of all, you do not have to pick your specializations for this trial based on this, but in any games you've played in the past, if you're familiar with these terms, what is your preferred play style? So if you want to be a little bit more general, you can say, aggressive or completionist, sort of any adjective in whatever realm. Alternatively, if you want to give us a playstyle in terms of mage or tank or healer, again, that you usually played, you don't have to today. Alright. And finally, how would you describe your gaming experience? So, just to throw some labels out there, for example, we say none. Of course, in this day and age, most people do have some gaming experience, but you can say none if, your main experience is, for instance, phone apps or something very casual like that. If you don't want to say none, of course, you can also use the label casual. Then we have moderate, or perhaps hardcore, or anything in between that you want to describe in a couple words. Okay, great. So those are actually all the questions we have about you. You will of course fill out a survey afterward about your experience, which will help us improve our product. But for now, let me help you begin to set up your character. Alright, so you'll notice that for each category, right now we only have about three choices. So I hope that's alright with you. It will still be fun. Of course, it's called the Game of Frustrating Choices, so each benefit provided by the choices you'll make is pretty well balanced by a strong downside. So we'll start with, first of all, your gender. These are pretty generic. It refers only to appearance. We didn't want to program in the benefits and downsides of that. Okay, great. So after that, we'll start with race. We only have 3, again, basic races. Pretty typical. The first one is human. And so humans in this game are very intelligent. They're good with tools and items. And their main downside is that they rely pretty heavily on those items, and that includes resources such as potions, other materials that you unearth. So they're very dependent on those, and they tend to use them up faster perhaps than you'll be able to replenish them. So a lot of the skill here comes from learning to balance what you find and use or save for later. Okay? Our second race is dwarves. These are sort of a hardier race. They are very adept at tunneling through the earth, shaping things out of earth and stone and metal. They have extra move speed in mountainous terrain. They're fairly good at earth magic, and they're excellent melee fighters. if it sounds like that's more than I mentioned for the humans, it's because humans are fairly balanced with most of those things. Sort of average but not great with most magic, a little bit worse at earth magic. Okay, so dwarves, they're excellent melee fighters. They're pretty bad with magic that isn't earth magic. In general, you can still learn spells as a dwarf character. And so you'll see that these pair fairly well with certain classes and not with others. Alright, so, and the downside of dwarves is that they do not regenerate health, at least when they're in the sun. So if you are underground, first of all the races have, the normal passive that you'd expect in a game where if you're not in combat, you regain a certain amount of health per second, which, is extremely useful and important. So the deal with dwarves is, if you are underground, they do, but if you are above ground, they do not regenerate health. So you may think that's not a problem, but actually most of this game takes place not in underground dungeons, but in open terrain, so that does apply much of the time. Alright, so the third race is going to be elves. And elves have excellent magical ability. They're really well suited to those classes. In addition to that, they tend to be good at ranged abilities, so bows and arrows and so forth. On the other hand, they are very weak and frail physically, and also they tend to get sort of emotionally involved with other characters in the game, which affects certain plot lines and quests, and you'll see how that applies as the game goes on. Alright, so those are your three races. Do you have an idea of which of those you'd like to be? Okay, yeah, we can decide after I list the classes. Good idea. Alright, so the first class is called, rather maybe uncreatively or oddly, the Good Witch class. And this is the same as Good Wizard. If you want, we can, we're trying to label it for sure, but if you'd like, you can think of them as both being witches, male and female, or both being wizards. It's the same thing in this particular game. So, by good we mean, the typical sort of white magic, and this doesn't include healing because that's a separate class. It is actually damaging spells, so I don't know if that's confusing to you, but basically the typical elements, and the difference is they're not concerned with death and destruction except where necessary. So there's not going to be sort of a inflicting sickness or a pestilence. It's going to be the sort of core elements, earth, water, fire, air, and you can specify later on what things you put points in, as with everything. So the downside of witches in this particular game is you happen to be very susceptible to water. So if you play almost any spec of witch, water will actually melt you, completely destroy you if you come into any contact with it. If you do play a witch and you spec into water control, then the same thing is true of cold or ice. So the second class is also magic based, and that is a necromancer. So, in opposition to the sort of good witch, this is a mage, essentially, whose powers are based in sickness and death, and your main spells often relate to raising things from the dead. However, your main downside is that you do have a chance of raising things from the dead that you do not want to raise from the dead. So maybe you go into a tavern and there's lots of dead bugs and flies, and they all get resurrected and follow you for a while and may even cloud your vision. Or maybe there's a boss battle and you kill something, and then you accidentally raise your own enemy from the dead. And in some games, it would fight on your side as your companion. But here, whatever you raise from the dead has the same alignment as it did before. So if the chance goes off and you raise something that was your enemy, you will have to fight it all over again. Healer is the third class. We are a little bit magic heavy right now, and that's going to be balanced out. So healers, of course, are based in mainly healing. Their damage is fairly low later on in the game, because this is a game in which you will be pairing up with other people and, of course, supporting them. So the downside of being a healer, I think the positive side's fairly obvious. You're pretty hardy, you can heal yourself and fix damage. The downside is that the grudge that players may hold against you for letting them die is actually implemented into the game. So basically it will calculate the chances that you had to save someone, and then it will reduce the ways in which they can help you for a limited amount of time. So you'll get maybe reduced protection from your teammates, or reduced trading even from strangers, because perhaps your teammates told them. So you may get higher cost at the next shop, and so forth. Alright. And of course, the other more consistently applicable downside, as I said, is that your damage output is not especially high. So the last class right now is a fighter, which is really a sort of broad label for two subclasses. One is the melee fighter, in the sense that it's damage based, sort of like a glass cannon, although maybe that term is usually used for mages. But so you'll do lots of damage, but you will be fairly squishy. Usually pretty fast too, but again, you'll need protection from healers, from tanks, because you won't have very much health. So that one, not so creative in terms of downsides, pretty typical stuff. And then the last choice, also under fighter, but a tank. So of course in this case, you'd be pretty fat in terms of, well, both physically large, but also have a lot of health. And the downside is that you, again, won't do much damage and you'll be pretty slow. Alright, so I apologize if some of that felt a little bit like review. Again, we do like to cater to both people who are familiar with games and not so much, so I do have to do the same sort of spiel regardless. It's just part of our methodology. So do you have an idea of what race and class you'd like to be? Okay, great. So let's get you set up just a bit more. Alright, so the the next thing that we're going to deal with is your items. So first of all, we'll start with your bag. So basically the backpack you carry around all game. And we have two, this is where the really difficult and frustrating choices begin. But alright, so you can either have a normal backpack as you'd have in, I'll put this in quotes, real life, if you were adventuring. So just a normal bag, you know, unlike a game. Not too much stuff would fit in it, but maybe you could get by with just a few provisions. You'd have to stock up fairly constantly. Alright, so first thing, bag of normalcy. Your second choice is going to be the bag of infinite holding. So what that does is it holds any amount of items while retaining its same shape. So it's going to be, you know, that's that very comfortably shaped backpack with padded straps, fits right on your back, and so forth. And so you could put any items into this bag and it would not change its shape. So you could just throw a sword in there, and so forth. However, the downside of this bag is that their weight still applies, even if their mass, or not their mass, but their volume does not. So even though you could theoretically fit any number of things in the bag, in practice you probably could not carry it because you're going to feel the full weight of everything in there. Alright? So the last bag to choose from is the bag of infinite lightness. So as you may have guessed, this is sort of the counterpart to the other one. So this will also hold any number of items, but it makes them magically weightless. So you could put, you know, there aren't cars in this game, but we'll say if you put a car in it, you could still carry it in terms of your muscle mass, your strength. It would just weigh almost nothing. However, its volume would remain the same. So you'd be walking around with a backpack the size of a car. Of course, you wouldn't fit through doorways, you'd have all kinds of problems. So there is still a functional limit to how much you could carry. Alright? So which one of those would you like to have? Okay, great. So our next choice is going to be your weapon. And of course, depending on your race and class and spec, certain people will rely more or less on weapons, but we have the same basic choices for everyone. So if you want to just for fun match them up a little differently, I won't really give you any advice per se, and I'll leave it up to you. So the first one is the Sword of Extreme Sharpness. So this is an extremely sharp sword. It can cut through bone pretty much instantaneously. That being said, if you touch its blade even a little bit, it'll also cut you. The sword is so sharp, in fact, that it cannot be held by any sheath. It'll just cut through it. You can't really hang it by your side anyway, because it would cut you if you walked a little bit oddly. And if you place it on the ground, it will cut through the earth up to its hilt, which is not terrible because it'll slide right out of the earth, but it's inconvenient, and basically you're gonna have to hold this sword at all times, or put it on the ground, so it might be difficult to kind of maneuver if you ever want, you know, a ranged weapon, or if you want to prevent other people from picking it up. So that's the first one. The second one is called the Sword of Uncomfortable Warmth. So this sword is still amazingly sharp. It still cuts through almost everything, but not to a problematic level, so it can be cut in a normal holster. If you're normally careful, you won't cut yourself. The downside being that the hilt is always uncomfortably hot. So it'll never burn you, but it'll always pretty much feel like it's about to burn you. So like holding a really hot plate as you bring it to the table and you can't wait to set it down. And nothing can be done about this, so the sensation travels through gloves. You can't just cast ice magic on it. So it's a very good weapon, but pretty rough to wield. The next one is a ranged weapon. It is called the Crossbow of Wondrous Display. And what this does is it auto-targets any enemy, so you don't even have to be good at aiming. And it also shoots these beautiful fireworks into the air every time you shoot the bow. So what that's gonna do, of course, besides entertain you and wow your drunk friends at the tavern, is also alert all nearby enemies to your position. So if you're not a big fan of aggro at all times, you might not want to go for this weapon. And the last starting weapon, and of course there are others to be found in the game, but this one is called the Weapon of Needfulness. So it's basically like a small box, a cube, and when you take it out, it turns into whatever weapon you most need at that moment. So if you need a dagger, it'll be a dagger. If you even need a gun, it can be a gun. If you somehow break both your arms in the game world, it'll become some sort of weapon usable by your feet. So it's pretty much always incredibly useful. However, what this little cube does is it also spawns a weapon for your enemy. And that weapon will be just for the duration of that battle, but it will be whatever is best suited to their needs. So whatever benefit you've gained, they pretty much gain one of equal value. So I'll give you a couple seconds, but do you have an idea of which one of those you might prefer? Alright, great. So next we will move on to armor. Alright, so armor will be pretty brief. These haven't been developed too much yet. And again, there's others to be found in the game. The first one is called the Armor of Protection and Vulnerability. So what this does, it's basically a plate mail that is also enchanted. It's pretty much impenetrable. It's a very strong armor, except for a 6x6 inch square area that is maintained wherever you'd least like to be hit. So of course you can maneuver yourself to protect that area, you know, and you might have some idea of what that might be. But it also, if you were previously injured before you donned this armor or re-put it on, you know, that might become the place you'd least like to be hit. So it is shifting sort of enchantment. So that's the first one. The second one is called the Armor of Desire. Unfortunately, right now, if you play as a female champion or a character, this is the only armor that you're able to choose. And this does have the added benefit of charisma, It'll make people, shopkeepers and so forth, treat you pretty well. It's a very sexy looking armor. That's pretty much all there is to it. It offers almost no protection, but it sure looks good. So the last one is a pretty typical metal armor, not enchanted to be as strong as the first one. This is called the Armor of Flashiness. Basically, it is super cool looking. It can blind your enemies with how bright it is. However, in the right light, it can also blind you, so be careful with that. Alright, so do you have a sense of which of those you might prefer? Alright, great. And we actually only have one more choice for you to make right now. And that's gonna be what trinket you would like. So, this is sort of a small item with an added benefit. The first one is called the Turquoise Bracelet of Weather Controlling. So basically, it's not complete control, but it gives you a chance to manipulate the weather in key situations. So, if you were on a lookout and you want it to be clear, there's a pretty good chance it can help you with that. It can hide you with fog or clouds. When you're higher level, you can even have a chance to summon tornadoes. And the downside is that any time when it's not critical, the weather will be pretty much the opposite of what you want. And remember that this is virtual reality, so you are going to feel the effects of the weather. So if you're walking all day in the hot sun, it'll be really hot. If you want it to be hot because you like that, it'll be gray and rainy and 40 degrees. So anytime when it's not critical, it'll be pretty impossible to control. And there is an algorithm that determines the danger you're in and when that's important. So the second one is called the Pendant of ASMR. This increases your healing abilities. It increases the benefits you gain from resting in inns and so forth. It also helps with your charisma, so it helps to sway shopkeepers, quest givers, and so forth. It can sort of soothe people, similar to hypnosis. The downside of this is you may be asked to rest or forced to take breaks from your journey more often. For instance, the innkeeper will persuade your party to stay. And you will have to perform mandatory checks on all of your teammates after every battle, such as hearing tests, vision tests, cranial nerve exams, which can be beneficial if they do have problems, but most of the time their problems don't lie in those areas, but mainly in the fact that they have just been in a bloody battle. So that's that. Finally, we have the Necklace of Warding. So what this does is it protects you from harmful spells for a limited time, so you can activate it. So, if someone's throwing lightning bolts at you and you think you can kill them if you can just live for a few more seconds, it can protect you. However, after a certain amount of time, it disappears and it returns the absorbed energy to the caster of the spells. So, if you didn't kill your enemy in that time, well, unfortunately for you, they're now sort of supercharged for a little while. Alright, so do you have a sense of which one of those you would like? Great. So, it seems like you're all set up. Of course, don't worry about when I say dying in the game. Of course, this is virtual reality, but that'll basically correlate with being knocked out of the game, so taken out of the world for a period of 30 seconds to a minute. Some other consequences: losing gold, possibility of losing items. Of course, you're not going to get injured in real life, although some degree of pain may be involved, and our doctors will of course talk to you about this further before you get involved in the game. So what I'm going to do now is pass you on to our medical professionals and our gear specialists. So what they're going to do is just make sure that you know, although you told us you didn't have relevant medical conditions, they're just going to make sure that you're sort of in the ideal shape for this experience. After that, of course, they'll get you set up with the suit and with the glasses that will allow for you to experience our virtual reality. Alright, well, thank you so much for coming today, and I wish you the best of luck. Thanks. Alright.